Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking about the objectivity of the New York Times. My name is Aleksandr Sinayev. A little bit about me. I'm a quantitative psychologist by training, which means that by training I deal with a lot of statistical models and how you can use them to analyze experimental data. But I got really interested in this textual processing stuff, and so this project is sort of a labor of love for me, so I hope you guys like it too. So the big question before I started on this project was, what is objectivity? How can we even measure this? Well, there's a traditional view on this that comes from philosophy that, there is a truth. This is empiricism or rationalism, so it's either we either have access to it because we see data or we interact with the world, or just through our heads we can infer the truth because we're rational beings. But in the 20th century, this view has come under attack. So more recently, the truth has been seen as sort of socially constructed. So in place of the traditional view of objectivity, there's a pragmatic view of objectivity that basically says, well, we don't know if there's a truth out there even, and we don't know if we can infer it using the data or using our minds. But what we can do is we can be consistent with the data, and our arguments can be consistent with themselves. So at least we can do better than not correspond to the world and not correspond to ourselves. So both of these views, though, are about content. So when you're being objective, you're reporting the right words, you're reporting the right thing. The third view of objectivity, and this is the view that I'm going to be taking, is sort of that objectivity is a pretense. And this is a little bit shocking, but this is sort of the view that sociologists endorse, that this is objectivity is basically a way that journalists can interact with other people in their organization and people outside of their organization, so they can avoid libel suits, they can avoid criticism and stuff like this by following certain guidelines. And the goal of this is not to get to some divine truth. The goal of this is I can tell my story, I can tell how I saw the world, but nobody will bother me about it. So I'm not going to get sued. Okay, and then so the difference here is that this is mostly about form. This is not about the actual content, what's in there. This is about how you say it and the relationships within the organization. Okay, and so a lot of this has been said before. I'm not a person who's making this up. What is sort of novel here is that an empirical investigation. There have been some empirical investigations that are related, but not in this form. So. Can the form and content of objectivity be reliably measured and compared across content areas and across time? So how do we operationalize this? So we could just identify subjective elements according to our definition. Like if you use a first-person narrative, like I think, that sounds subjective, so that should be subjective. That's one way we could do this. But we could also take an automatized approach. So we could train a classifier to distinguish between two sets of textual data, one of which is very much subjective, that we can all agree is subjective, and the other is objective, that we can all agree is objective. The nice thing is that a lot of data is available on movies. So they have these great repositories that are really well coded. They're really well manicured just exactly for this purpose, so that you can textually analyze them. And movies, if you're aware of this, people write both movie synopses, so that just tells you exactly what happened in the movie in a very kind of objective tone, but also there are movie reviews. And so I'm sure you guys are aware of this. People criticize movies, and sometimes they like them and sometimes they don't. Okay, so the data is, I got 2,000 reviews. This is one of those great data sets, 2,000 synopses, and all the New York Times articles that I could get my hands on, which was basically everything between 1981 and 2006, and then after that they don't make it available. And I think I used everything from 1984 because it became more consistent with what they had online. So I had to do a little bit of pre-processing. I deleted common nine diagnostic words like a or on. I changed numbers to generic features, so like the number 1023, there's nothing specific about the number 1023 that we care about, so I just changed it to 4-digit number. And I made a bunch of changes like this so that the words are consistent and we can generalize across them. I used words and word bigrams as features, so this isn't quite as nice as what you're suggesting. I didn't use the grammatical structure of the language, but at least I can have phrases as units of phrases as the features, and whole articles were the units of analysis. Okay, so the classifier was a naive Bayes classifier. The reason I used this was because previous research has shown that naive Bayes performs at least as well or better than more complex algorithms for sentiment analysis, and this is pretty close to sentiment analysis. And also, I did test a couple of other classifiers, and naive Bayes did very well. I trained it on 3/4 of each of the data sets and tested it on the remaining quarter. And so this is what the classifier did. Basically, phrases like "I thought" were very indicative that it was a review. So this is the number of reviews that had this phrase. This is the number of synopses that had this phrase. "You will," also highly indicative of a review. "Is certainly," highly indicative of a review. "Were hurt," highly indicative of a synopsis. So we might ask, well, did it work? So it worked on the test data. It classified over 80% of them correctly. It's not perfect, but it's doing something. And when I applied it to the New York Times data, it also classified most of the articles as certainly subjective. So it was 0.999 that this is a subjective article. But to answer the question of whether this whole process works for the New York Times, I looked at opinion pieces and editorials separately from the rest of the news pieces. And so it did say that opinion pieces are very subjective. So opinion pieces on average were at only 0.01 of them were not certainly subjective. Okay. The political news, on the other hand, so this is local, international, and national news. These average 0.15, so that's considerably higher. I'm not going to show you p-values. It's, there's like a million. There's 500,000 articles. Articles remain subjective over time. So this is again the local, national, international news. So you can see there's a little bit of a decline here in subjectivity and some wobbling across time, but for the most part, it stays where it is. The downward trend is significant, though, because everything here is significant. Okay, so what else do we have? What else is interesting is that business articles tended to be quite objective compared to the other articles. So, if you read the business section of the New York Times, this is sort of this makes sense. They take this very, very cold view. Science and technology, so this was sort of surprising to me. They tended to be quite subjective compared to the other articles. And why was this surprising? Because, science and technology is supposed to be this, like, cold, objective thing. But that's not what this shows. And so I was sort of surprised by this, and I went into it a little further, and I was looking at the way that they use numbers. And actually, these science articles and technology articles, they tend not to use a lot of numbers as well. And this was still surprising to me, but I read a little bit more about it, and there seems to be a trend across time that science the popular science editorials are becoming more and more accessible to people, and they're really taking this to heart that we need to make this relatable to people. So I think that's where those numbers are coming from. And this was probably the most interesting thing. Front page articles were very subjective. So this is compared to the other articles, they would be like here. The front page articles are almost always considered subjective. And I also repeated this with the numbers analysis, and front page articles have a lot less numbers than the other articles. So this is sort of consistent with the narrative view that they're trying to draw people into the story, and then you can get the actual facts later. Okay, so if they're subjective, we might want to answer the question, well, what are they saying? Are they being positive or negative? The nice thing about these review articles is that they're actually coded for whether they're positive or negative, so I can train another classifier to do this. And it also did fairly well. And probably the most meaningful place to apply these classifiers to the opinion articles, because in general they are expressing some sort of opinion. And what I found is that the opinion pieces are becoming steadily more positive over time. The odd thing, if you're familiar with American history, which many of you hopefully are, there's no hump in the 90s, which you would expect, and then you would expect it to go down again after 9/11, maybe, because between the end of the Cold War and 9/11 is kind of thought of as, oh, things were good, but that's not what these opinion articles reflect. Other articles stayed relatively positive over time. So some conclusions. Objectivity, at least in as much as I showed you here, it seems like objectivity can be measured through simple word pairs. And news articles seem to concentrate on positive subjective judgments, at least in as much as they resemble positive reviews. And positivity of the articles has little to do with the state of the world. Okay, and some limitations. I did emphasize form, and this was pretty much solely about form. I recognize that because one article can describe very objectively what one person from the corner thinks. That doesn't make it an objective article. That just makes the form of the article objective. I completely ignored the relationships within the organization that also shape the perceptions of objectivity in these newspapers. And content, maybe I had a little bit of content in there in as much as the movie synopses and reviews overlap in terms of content with the newspapers. The other thing is objectivity was harder to pin down than subjectivity. So remember when I showed you those 4 words? It wasn't an accident that only one of them was highly indicative of objectivity. A lot more words were highly indicative of subjectivity, and the lack of those words was what drove an article to be objective. The absolute numbers that I showed you should be taken with a grain of salt. So the fact that they're 0.8, subjective, that's not really very meaningful because newspaper articles are neither reviews nor synopses. So this is only a metaphor. But the relationships over time and relationships between content areas, I think, do hold meaning. Okay. So this is still not been published. So if you're interested in this stuff, please contact me. All right. Thanks.